The fog hung thick over London's West End that November evening in 1891, swirling through the gaslit streets like the restless spirits of the dead. I had just settled into my chair beside the fire at 221B Baker Street, nursing a brandy and contemplating the day's medical rounds, when Mrs. Hudson's urgent rap upon our door shattered the evening's tranquility. "Gentlemen," she announced breathlessly, "there's a lady to see you. Most distressed she is, and speaking of ghosts and murder, most foul." Holmes, who had been examining a peculiar tobacco ash through his magnifying glass, looked up with that familiar gleam of interest lighting his grey eyes. "Show her up immediately, Mrs. Hudson. Watson, it appears our quiet evening is at an end." The woman who entered our sitting room was perhaps 40 years of age, though her haggard appearance suggested she had aged considerably in recent hours. Her once elegant burgundy dress was wrinkled, her dark hair dishevelled beneath a small velvet hat, and her gloved hands trembled as she clutched a silk reticule to her breast. "Mr. Holmes," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I am Lady Catherine Pemberton. You must help us. Something terrible has happened at the Orpheum Theatre, something that defies all rational explanation." Holmes gestured to the chair opposite his own. "Please, Lady Pemberton, compose yourself and tell us everything. Leave out no detail, however insignificant it may seem." She accepted the seat gratefully, though her posture remained rigid with anxiety. "The Orpheum has been closed these 17 years, Mr. Holmes, ever since," she shuddered, "ever since the tragedy of 1874. "Ah, yes," Holmes murmured, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "The death of Edmund Blackwood, the celebrated actor. If memory serves, he was found dead upon the stage during a performance of Macbeth, struck down by a falling piece of scenery." "You know of it?" Lady Pemberton's eyes widened. "It was rather sensational at the time. The papers spoke of a curse upon the theatre, did they not? Some nonsense about the Scottish play bringing misfortune to all who dared perform it within those walls." "It was no nonsense, Mr. Holmes," she exclaimed, leaning forward. "Edmund was my late husband's dearest friend. Lord Pemberton was in the audience that very night. He witnessed the horror firsthand, the way Edmund seemed to struggle against invisible hands before the sandbag fell, crushing his skull. And the screams, Mr. Holmes, the terrible screams that echoed through the theatre, even after Edmund lay still." Holmes's expression remained sceptical, but he nodded for her to continue. "My husband purchased the theatre the following year, thinking to renovate it and restore its former glory. But the workers fled after the first week, claiming they heard footsteps on the empty stage and voices calling from the fly gallery. The Orpheum has stood abandoned ever since, until now." "And what has prompted this sudden revival?" I inquired, setting down my brandy. "My stepson, Gerald," she replied, her voice tight with concern. "He inherited the theatre upon his father's death last spring. Despite my pleas, he was determined to see his father's dream fulfilled. He gathered a company of actors, hired the finest carpenters and painters in London, and spent months preparing for tonight's grand reopening with a new production of Hamlet." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Another tragedy? Rather bold, considering the theatre's reputation. Gerald believed that avoiding Macbeth would break the curse." Lady Pemberton's laugh was bitter. How wrong he was. "What exactly has transpired?" Holmes asked, his voice sharp with interest. "This afternoon, during the final dress rehearsal, something dreadful occurred. The lead actor, Mr. Cornelius Ashford, a man of considerable reputation and skill, was found dead in the most impossible circumstances." I leaned forward, my medical instincts aroused. "How did he die?" "He was discovered hanging from the stage rigging, 30 feet above the boards. But here is the inexplicable part, gentlemen. The stage was locked from the inside. Gerald had the only key, and he was in his office with witnesses at the time of the death. The other entrances to the stage were bolted shut from within. No living soul could have entered or left that space." Holmes's eyes glittered with the thrill of a puzzle. "Who discovered the body?" "The stage manager, Mr. Tobias Grimm, when he went to call the company for the final scene. He found the stage door locked and had to fetch Gerald for the key. When they entered—" She paused, pressing a handkerchief to her lips. Poor Cornelius hung there like a marionette, his face contorted in terror, as if he had seen the very devil himself. And the other members of the company, where were they at the time? Scattered throughout the theatre, Miss Helena Fairfax, our leading lady, was in her dressing room with her maid. Mr. Sebastian Cross, who plays Laertes, was in the property room checking his sword. The others were either in the green tent behind the stage or had stepped out for air. Holmes rose and began pacing before the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. "Tell me about Mr. Ashford. What manner of man was he?" "Talented but temperamental. He had performed Hamlet many times before, though never to such acclaim as he hoped to achieve at the Orpheum. There were tensions within the company." "What sort of tensions?" Lady Pemberton glanced between Holmes and myself before speaking. Cornelius and Miss Fairfax had been engaged to be married, but she recently broke off the engagement. There were also financial disputes. Cornelius felt he deserved a larger share of the profits, and there had been heated words between him and Gerald just yesterday. "Most illuminating. And you suspect supernatural intervention?" "What else can it be?" she cried. "The theatre is cursed, Mr. Holmes. The phantom of Edmund Blackwood has returned to claim another victim. Even now, the remaining actors speak of fleeing London rather than face opening night tomorrow." Holmes stopped his pacing and fixed her with a penetrating stare. "There will be no opening night if I have my way, Lady Pemberton. This matter requires immediate investigation. Watson, fetch your coat and bag. We leave for the Orpheum at once." As we prepared to depart, Holmes turned back to our visitor. "One more question, if you please. Has anyone else reported seeing or hearing anything unusual in the theatre during the renovation?" Lady Pemberton nodded gravely. "Several of the workers claimed to see a figure in period costume watching them from the boxes. A tall man in a black evening coat and white cravat, the very costume Edmund Blackwood wore on the night he died. And there have been sounds, Mr. Holmes. Footsteps echoing through empty corridors, doors slamming when no wind stirs, and always the sound of someone weeping in the darkness." The November night seemed to grow colder as we made our way through the fog-shrouded streets toward the West End. The Orpheum Theatre loomed before us like a great wounded beast, its neoclassical facade scarred by years of neglect despite the recent renovation efforts. Gas lamps flickered at the entrance, casting dancing shadows across the marble columns and ornate carvings that spoke of the building's former grandeur. A small crowd had gathered despite the late hour, curious onlookers drawn by whispers of scandal and supernatural terror. Police constables kept them at bay while detectives from Scotland Yard conducted their preliminary investigation. Inspector Gregson emerged from the theatre's main entrance as our hansom cab drew to a halt. His usually confident demeanor seemed shaken, and I noticed his hand trembling slightly as he lit his pipe. "Holmes," he called out with evident relief, "thank God you've come. This business has my lads spooked, and I'll admit it has me puzzled as well." "What have you discovered thus far?" Holmes inquired as we approached the theatre's entrance. "Precious little that makes sense," Gregson replied grimly. "The deceased is one Cornelius Ashford, age 34, an actor of some renown, found hanging from the rigging mechanism some 30 feet above the stage floor. The peculiar thing is, there's no way he could have gotten up there on his own. The rope ladder to the fly gallery was pulled up and secured." "Suicide?" I suggested. "Impossible, Doctor. The knot around his neck was tied in a most professional manner, but his hands show no rope burns or other evidence that he climbed to that height himself. Moreover, the stage was locked from within with no other means of access available." Holmes examined the theatre's exterior with his characteristic attention to detail, running his hands along the walls and peering up at the upper-story windows. "These windows, are any accessible from the street?" "All barred or too high to reach without a considerable ladder," Gregson replied. "We've checked every possible entrance. The mystery deepens with each passing hour." As we entered the theatre proper, I was struck by the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to cling to every surface. Despite the recent renovation, there remained an underlying sense of decay and abandonment. The lobby, though freshly painted and carpeted, felt hollow and unwelcoming. Ornate chandeliers cast eerie shadows on the walls, and every footstep echoed with unnatural resonance. "The company is assembled in the green room," Gregson informed us as we made our way through the maze of corridors. "They're all quite shaken, as you might imagine. Some are speaking of leaving London immediately. Holmes paused at a doorway marked private and tested the handle. Finding it unlocked, he pushed it open to reveal a narrow staircase leading upward. Where does this lead? To the administrative offices and storage rooms above, came a voice from behind us. We turned to see a young man of perhaps 25, well-dressed but with the pallor of recent shock. I am Gerald Pemberton. Lady Catherine said she was fetching you. Holmes studied the young theatre owner with keen interest. Gerald Pemberton possessed the refined features of good breeding, but his eyes held a haunted quality that spoke of deeper troubles than the evening's tragedy. His dark hair was dishevelled, his evening clothes rumpled, and his hands bore traces of sawdust and paint, evidence of his personal involvement in the theatre's restoration. Mr. Pemberton, Holmes said, I understand you were in your office when Mr. Ashford met his fate. Can you account for your movements this afternoon with precision? Certainly. I was reviewing the final accounts with my secretary, Mr. James Whitmore, from 3 o'clock until nearly 5. We were interrupted only once when Tobias Grimm came to report that one of the backdrop ropes had snapped during rehearsal. And Mr. Ashford's mood during today's rehearsal? Was he his usual self? Gerald's expression darkened. Cornelius was difficult. He had been increasingly temperamental over the past week, making demands and threatening to withdraw from the production unless his terms were met. This morning, he was particularly agitated about something, though he wouldn't say what. Did he speak of any fears, any concerns about the theatre's reputation? Quite the opposite. Cornelius scoffed at the stories of Edmund Blackwood's ghost. He claimed that superstition was the refuge of inferior minds, and that he intended to prove the theatre's curse was nothing but theatrical nonsense. Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with me. Ironic, given the circumstances. Now, Mr. Pemberton, I should like to examine the scene of the crime before we speak with the other members of your company. As we made our way deeper into the theatre, the sense of unease grew more pronounced. The corridors seemed to whisper with half-remembered echoes, and shadows moved at the edges of vision in ways that defied the steady glow of the gas lamps. Even Holmes, typically immune to atmospheric influences, appeared more alert and cautious than usual. The stage itself was a magnificent sight, despite the horror it now harbored. The proscenium arch soared 40 feet above us, decorated with gilt cherubs and classical motifs that caught and reflected the light from dozens of calcium lamps. The set for Hamlet dominated the boards, a convincing recreation of Elsinore Castle's great hall, complete with towering columns, stone battlements, and a throne that seemed to brood with royal menace. But it was the sight above that drew our attention with horrible fascination. Cornelius Ashford's body had been cut down by the police, but the rope from which he had hung still dangled from the fly gallery like an accusation. The rigging system itself was a marvel of Victorian engineering, a complex network of ropes, pulleys, and counterweights that allowed for the swift movement of scenery and drops. How does one gain access to the fly gallery? Holmes inquired. Gregson pointed to a rope ladder secured to the stage left wall. That's the only way up, and it was pulled up and tied off when we arrived. No one could have descended from above without lowering it first. Holmes examined the ladder mechanism with characteristic thoroughness, running his fingers along the ropes and testing the security of the fastenings. Interesting. This system appears to be original to the theatre, dating back at least 20 years. See here, Watson. These ropes show considerable wear, yet this section— he indicated a length of rope near the top. This section is relatively new. What do you make of it? I asked. Perhaps nothing, or perhaps everything. The answer lies in the details, my dear fellow, and there are many details yet to be examined. As Holmes conducted his investigation of the rigging, I found myself studying the stage itself for any clues that might have been overlooked. The floorboards were ancient but well-maintained, marked by decades of performances and the scuffs of countless actors' feet. Painted lines indicated the positions for various scenes, and I could make out the faint outlines where sets had been marked for placement. It was then that I noticed something peculiar near the base of one of the Hamlet set's false columns. A small object glinted in the gaslight, partially hidden beneath a fold of painted canvas. Kneeling down, I carefully extracted what appeared to be a gentleman's cufflink. Gold, with an unusual design that seemed to incorporate both theatrical and occult symbolism. "Holmes," I called softly, not wishing to alert Gregson to my discovery just yet. "A moment, if you please." Holmes descended from his examination of the rigging and joined me beside the column. His eyes immediately fixed upon the cufflink in my palm, and I saw his pupils dilate with interest. "Most curious, Watson. The design appears to be that of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, a rather exclusive society devoted to ceremonial magic and occult practices. Not the sort of jewelry one would expect to find upon a theatrical stage, particularly not one supposedly haunted by supernatural forces. Could it belong to the deceased? Possible, though unlikely. Ashford struck me from Lady Pemberton's description as a practical man, skeptical of supernatural nonsense. Moreover, this cufflink bears the mark of Garrard & Co., jewelers to the Crown. An expensive piece and relatively new. Someone of considerable means lost this. Before we could examine the cufflink further, we were interrupted by a commotion from the direction of the green room. Raised voices, including what sounded like a woman's hysterical sobbing, echoed through the theatre's corridors. "We'd best see what fresh drama has unfolded," Holmes said, pocketing the cufflink. "In my experience, the aftermath of murder often reveals as much as the crime itself." The green room, traditionally a sanctuary where actors could relax between scenes, had been transformed into a chamber of barely contained panic. 5 individuals sat or paced about the modestly furnished space, their faces reflecting various degrees of shock, fear, and suspicion. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the lingering scent of grease paint and powder. A woman in her late 20s, possessed of striking beauty despite her current distress, sat weeping into a lace handkerchief. Her golden hair was elaborately arranged, and her costume, a burgundy gown suitable for Gertrude, Hamlet's mother, was of the finest quality. This, I surmised, was Miss Helena Fairfax, the leading lady and Ashford's former fiancée. Beside her stood a tall, athletic man with dark hair and penetrating blue eyes. His own costume identified him as Laertes, and the protective manner in which he hovered near Miss Fairfax suggested a personal as well as professional interest in her welfare. This would be Sebastian Cross, the actor Gerald had mentioned. An older gentleman with silver hair and distinguished bearing occupied an armchair near the fireplace, seemingly the calmest of the group despite the gravity of the situation. His costume marked him as Polonius, and everything about his demeanor suggested years of theatrical experience and the steadiness that comes with age. The remaining 2 members of the company presented a study in contrasts. A thin, nervous man with prematurely graying hair paced near the window, occasionally glancing toward the door as if calculating his chances of escape. The final member was a woman of middle years, plainly dressed and bearing the practical air of someone accustomed to managing the details others overlooked. "Ladies and gentlemen," Holmes announced as we entered, "I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague, Dr. Watson. We have been asked to investigate the tragic circumstances surrounding Mr. Ashford's death." The thin man immediately stopped his pacing. "Thank heavens. Perhaps now we can get some answers. I am Reginald Morse, and I play the ghost of Hamlet's father, though I must say after tonight's events I have no stomach for supernatural roles." The distinguished older gentleman rose from his chair. "Sir Nigel Worthington, at your service. I confess, Mr. Holmes, that in 40 years upon the stage I have never encountered anything quite so disturbing as this afternoon's tragedy." "And I am Mrs. Beatrice Hartwell," the practical-looking woman added. "I serve as wardrobe mistress and general factotum for the company. Poor dear Cornelius," she continued, dabbing at her eyes with a plain cotton handkerchief. "To think that he should meet such an end, and in such impossible circumstances." Holmes's attention focused immediately upon Sebastian Cross, who had not yet introduced himself and seemed reluctant to meet the detective's gaze directly. "And you, sir, are the gentleman who plays Laertes?" "Sebastian Cross," came the terse reply. "I fail to see how any of us can help you, Mr. Holmes. What happened to Cornelius defies rational explanation. Perhaps it's time we accepted that some things lie beyond the realm of human understanding." "On the contrary, Mr. Cross," Holmes replied mildly. "I have found that the impossible often becomes merely improbable once all the facts are properly examined. Now then, I should like each of you to tell me exactly where you were and what you were doing between the hours of 4 and 5 o'clock this afternoon." Miss Fairfax looked up from her handkerchief, her eyes red with weeping. "I was in my dressing room, preparing for the final scene. My maid Jenny was with me the entire time, helping me with a costume change that had been giving us trouble." "And this maid can verify your whereabouts throughout that period?" "Certainly. Jenny has been with me for 3 years and is utterly reliable." Holmes made a note in his pocketbook before turning to Sebastian Cross. "Mr. Cross?" The actor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I was in the property room, examining the swords we use for the duel scene. One of them had developed a loose pommel, and I was attempting to tighten it." "Were you alone?" "Yes. The property room is quite small, and I prefer to work undisturbed when handling weapons." "Most prudent. Sir Nigel." The elderly actor cleared his throat. "I was in my dressing room reviewing my lines for the final act. At my age, one cannot be too careful about memorization. I saw no one and spoke to no one during that hour." "Mr. Morse?" The nervous actor resumed his pacing. "I was outside in the alley behind the theatre. I needed air. The atmosphere in this place has been oppressive all week. I spoke briefly with a flower seller who had set up her cart nearby." "And you, Mrs. Hartwell?" "I was in the costume room, making final adjustments to Miss Fairfax's gown for tomorrow night's performance. The hem required several inches of alteration." Holmes closed his pocketbook and studied the assembled group. "Most interesting. It appears that with the exception of Miss Fairfax, each of you was alone during the critical period. How convenient for our phantom." "What do you mean by that?" Sebastian Cross demanded, his voice sharp with suspicion. "Simply that murder is most easily accomplished when there are no witnesses to inconvenience the perpetrator," Holmes replied calmly. "Tell me, how well did each of you know Mr. Ashford before joining this company?" The question seemed to strike the group like a physical blow, and I observed several exchanges of meaningful glances before anyone responded. Sir Nigel spoke first. "Cornelius and I had worked together on 2 previous occasions, once in Edinburgh and once in Manchester. He was a competent actor, though somewhat full of himself." "Had you any personal difficulties with him?" "None whatsoever. We maintained a cordial professional relationship." "Miss Fairfax?" The young woman's composure cracked slightly. "Cornelius and we had been engaged to be married, but I recently realized that we were not suited to one another, and I broke off the engagement 3 weeks ago. He did not take the news well." "In what way did he react poorly?" "He became possessive, jealous. He accused me of having feelings for another member of the company and threatened to expose what he called secrets that would ruin us all." Holmes's eyebrows rose sharply. "Most intriguing. And did he specify the nature of these secrets?" "No, but his manner suggested he believed he held some power over us. It was most unpleasant." "Mr. Cross, did Mr. Ashford ever make any such threats or accusations to you directly?" Sebastian's face darkened. "Cornelius was a fool and a bully. He seemed to believe that his talent gave him license to torment others, but I paid little attention to his ravings." "That hardly answers my question." For a moment it seemed as though Cross might refuse to respond. Then his shoulders sagged slightly. "Yes, he made accusations, groundless ones. He suggested that my interest in Miss Fairfax was improper and that my background was not what I claimed it to be." "And is your background what you claim it to be?" "I am an actor, Mr. Holmes. We all play roles, both on and off the stage." Before Holmes could pursue this evasive answer further, we were interrupted by the entrance of a harried-looking man in his 50s, his clothes disheveled and his manner agitated. "Mr. Grimm, I presume?" Holmes inquired. "Tobias Grimm, stage manager," the newcomer confirmed, removing his hat and running nervous fingers through his thinning hair. "Forgive my appearance, gentlemen, but this business has left me quite undone. In 30 years of theatre work, I have never encountered anything so disturbing." "You discovered the body, I understand." "Indeed, though I wish to God I had not. I went to call the company for the final scene and found the stage door locked. Most unusual, as we never secure it during rehearsals. When Mr. Pemberton unlocked it..." He shuddered visibly. Poor Cornelius hung there like a broken puppet, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. "You're certain the door was locked from the inside?" "Absolutely. The key was in the lock on the stage side, and the bolt was thrown as well. There was no way anyone could have left that stage after what was done." Holmes made several more notes before closing his pocketbook. "Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your cooperation. I strongly advise all of you to remain in London until this matter is resolved. Inspector Gregson will provide you with details regarding any restrictions on your movements." As we prepared to leave the green room, Mrs. Hartwell approached Holmes with obvious reluctance. "Mr. Holmes," she said in a low voice, "there is something else you should know, something the others have not mentioned." "Indeed." 3 nights ago, during our dress rehearsal for the second act, several of us heard sounds, footsteps above the stage, though no one was in the fly gallery, and voices, whispered conversations that seemed to come from the empty boxes. What sort of conversations? We couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, almost conspiratorial. It happened twice, always during the same scene, when Hamlet confronts his mother in her chamber. Holmes's eyes glittered with interest. "Did anyone investigate these sounds?" "Mr. Grimm sent 2 of the stagehands to search the upper levels, but they found nothing. The next morning, however, we discovered that someone had been in the theatre during the night." "What evidence of this intrusion?" "Small things, mostly. Props moved from their assigned positions, costumes disturbed in the wardrobe room, and, this is the strangest part, fresh flowers had been placed on the stage where Edmund Blackwood died 17 years ago." "What sort of flowers?" "White lilies, a full dozen of them, arranged as though for a funeral. No one in the company claimed responsibility, and the theatre had been locked all night." Holmes absorbed this information with the intensity of a hunting hound catching a scent. "Mrs. Hartwell, I believe you may have provided the key to this entire puzzle. One final question. Have you noticed anyone in the company displaying unusual interest in the theatre's history or in the circumstances of Edmund Blackwood's death?" The wardrobe mistress considered the question carefully. "Now that you mention it, Mr. Cross has asked several questions about the original tragedy. He seemed particularly interested in the exact location where Blackwood died and the details of how the accident occurred. As we made our way back through the theatre's labyrinthine corridors, Holmes maintained a thoughtful silence. The building seemed even more oppressive now, with shadows gathering in every corner and the very air thick with unspoken secrets. The gas lamps flickered irregularly, casting dancing patterns on the walls that resembled writhing figures. "What do you make of it all, Holmes?" I asked as we paused in the lobby. "A most fascinating case, Watson. We have a locked-room mystery with supernatural trappings, a company of actors each harboring secrets, and evidence of someone with deep knowledge of the theatre's tragic history taking an active interest in current events. Do you believe in the possibility of supernatural intervention?" Holmes smiled grimly. "You know my views on such matters. When we have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. In this case, I suspect we shall find that our phantom is quite corporeal indeed." As we emerged into the fog-shrouded street, Holmes suddenly gripped my arm. "Watson, look there, in the upper window of the theatre." I followed his gaze upward to see a figure silhouetted against the faint glow of gaslight, a tall man in evening dress, watching us with what seemed like malevolent attention. "Good God!" I exclaimed. "Is that—" But even as I spoke, the figure vanished, leaving only an empty window and the unsettling certainty that our investigation had only just begun to unveil the dark secrets of the Orpheum Theatre. The following morning dawned grey and cheerless, with a persistent drizzle that seemed to mirror the gloom that had settled over the Orpheum Theatre case. I found Holmes already dressed and examining the mysterious cufflink we had discovered the previous evening, his magnifying glass revealing details invisible to the naked eye. "Ah, Watson," he said without looking up, "I trust you slept better than I did. This case has presented several puzzling aspects that refuse to allow my mind any rest. What have you discovered about the cufflink?" "Several interesting facts. First, as I suspected, it bears the hallmark of Garrard & Co. and the workmanship suggests it was crafted within the past 2 years. Second, the occult symbolism is not merely decorative, it represents specific degrees of initiation within the Hermetic order of the Golden Dawn. This particular combination of symbols would only be worn by someone who had achieved considerable standing within that organization. I accepted the cup of coffee Mrs. Hudson had brought up and settled into my chair. Do you suppose one of the theatre company is involved with this Golden Dawn Society? More than involved, Watson. I spent several hours this morning consulting my files on various occult organizations in London. The Golden Dawn, while secretive, has attracted several prominent members of society, including artists, writers, and, significantly, theatrical personalities. You suspect someone in the company? I suspect everyone in the company, my dear fellow. Last night's interviews revealed that each person had both motive and opportunity, despite their carefully constructed alibis. Miss Fairfax, spurned and perhaps threatened with exposure of some secret. Mr. Cross, clearly harboring feelings for the leading lady and defensive about his past. Even the seemingly benign Sir Nigel showed signs of concealing something significant. Holmes rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the dreary London street. But there is more to this puzzle than simple jealousy or revenge. The placement of those white lilies, the figure we glimpsed in the upper window, the professional manner in which Ashford was hanged, all suggest careful planning and intimate knowledge of the theatre's layout and history. What is our next course of action? We return to the Orpheum, but this time we examine it by daylight, when its secrets may be more readily apparent. I also wish to speak with some individuals who were not present last evening, the secretary, Mr. Whitmore, the maid Jenny, and perhaps most importantly, any surviving witnesses to Edmund Blackwood's original death. An hour later, we stood once again before the Orpheum Theatre, though it presented a markedly different appearance in the grey morning light. The Gothic Revival architecture, so imposing and mysterious by gaslight, now seemed merely faded and worn. The recent renovation work was more apparent. Fresh paint on the trim, new window boxes, and scrubbed stonework that hadn't quite managed to erase 17 years of neglect. Inspector Gregson met us at the stage door, looking haggard and frustrated. "Morning, Holmes. I've had my lads working through the night examining every inch of that rigging system. The rope that killed Ashford was definitely tampered with, shortened and retied with a hangman's knot that would have required considerable skill to fashion. Any fingerprints on the rope? None that we could make out clearly. Whoever did this wore gloves and knew their business. We did find something else, though, traces of sawdust in the victim's hair and on his clothing." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Sawdust? From what source?" "Could be from the carpentry work that's been ongoing, but it's a particular type. Very fine, almost powdery. My sergeant thinks it might be from a magician's apparatus or theatrical effect." "Most interesting. Have you questioned the carpenters and other workmen involved in the renovation?" "Aye, and that's where things get curious. According to the foreman, all work was completed 2 weeks ago, and no one has been doing any sawing or sanding since then. Yet this sawdust appears to be fresh." As we made our way through the theatre, Holmes examined every surface with meticulous care. In the daylight streaming through the high windows, the building's grandeur was more apparent, but so too were the signs of its troubled past. Despite the renovation, there remained an underlying atmosphere of decay and abandonment that no amount of fresh paint could entirely dispel. We found Gerald Pemberton in his office, a well-appointed room above the main lobby that overlooked the street. He appeared to have aged years in the space of a single night, his face pale and drawn, his hands trembling slightly as he attempted to review correspondence. "Mr. Holmes," he said, rising unsteadily from his desk, "thank God you've come. I've been receiving telegrams all morning. Investors withdrawing their support, actors threatening to leave, and newspaper reporters demanding statements about the curse of the Orpheum." "Tell me about your father's purchase of this theatre," Holmes said, settling into a chair opposite the desk. "What motivated him to acquire a property with such a dark reputation?" Gerald's expression grew distant. "Father was obsessed with the place. He had been Edmund Blackwood's closest friend since their school days at Oxford. When Edmund died, Father blamed himself for not preventing the tragedy somehow. He felt that restoring the theatre to its former glory would be a form of atonement." "Did your father ever speak of the specific circumstances of Blackwood's death?" often, particularly in his final years. He insisted that what happened that night was no accident. According to father, Edmund had been receiving anonymous threats in the weeks leading up to his death, warnings to abandon his role in Macbeth or face dire consequences. Holmes leaned forward with interest. "Did your father preserve any of these threatening messages?" "I believe so. After his death, I found a collection of papers related to the Orpheum locked in his private safe. I haven't had the heart to examine them thoroughly, but there were several letters and newspaper clippings from 1874. I should very much like to examine these documents." Gerald rose and moved to a painting on the wall behind his desk, a portrait of a distinguished gentleman in Victorian evening dress. With practiced movements, he swung the painting aside to reveal a small wall safe. "Father was quite secretive about these documents," Gerald explained as he worked the combination. "He made me promise never to share them with anyone unless something happened to revive the theatre's curse." The safe contained a leather portfolio tied with black ribbon. Gerald handed it to Holmes with obvious reluctance, as though parting with something that might better remain buried. Holmes untied the ribbon and began examining the contents with characteristic thoroughness. The portfolio contained newspaper clippings, personal letters, and what appeared to be official reports from the original investigation into Edmund Blackwood's death. "Fascinating," Holmes murmured as he studied a yellowed letter. "This is addressed to Blackwood and dated 3 days before his death. Listen to this, Watson. The ancient curse of the Scottish play shall not be mocked. Abandon your blasphemous performance, or join the countless actors who have paid the ultimate price for their hubris. The Order of the Sacred Stage watches and judges all." "The Order of the Sacred Stage?" I asked. "I've never heard of such an organization. Nor had I until now, but notice the letterhead, the same occult symbols we found on the cufflink, though arranged in a different pattern." Holmes continued reading. "Here's another even more specific. Edmund Blackwood, your final performance approaches. The rigging above the stage has been prepared for your grand exit. Break your contract with the Orpheum, or the curtain shall fall forever." Gerald paled visibly. Good God! If father knew about these threats, why didn't he share them with the police? "Perhaps he did," Holmes replied, extracting a folded document from the portfolio. "Yes, here's a copy of a statement given to Inspector Morrison of Scotland Yard, dated November 15th, 1874, 2 days after Blackwood's death. Your father reported the threatening letters and expressed his belief that his friend had been murdered." "What was the official conclusion?" Holmes examined another document. "Death by misadventure. The investigating officer concluded that the sandbag which struck Blackwood had been improperly secured and fell due to the vibrations of the performance. The threatening letters were dismissed as the work of theatrical rivals or religious extremists opposed to the production. But you suspect otherwise." "I suspect that 17 years ago, someone succeeded in committing what appeared to be an impossible murder, and that same someone or their protege has now struck again. We were interrupted by a soft knock at the office door. Gerald called for the visitor to enter, and a thin, nervous-looking man in his 30s appeared, carrying a sheaf of papers and wearing the harried expression of an overworked secretary. "Forgive the intrusion, Mr. Pemberton," the man said, "but there are several urgent matters requiring your attention." "Mr. Whitmore," Gerald said, "allow me to present Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. Gentlemen, this is James Whitmore, my secretary and general assistant." Holmes studied the newcomer with evident interest. Whitmore was impeccably dressed despite the early hour, his dark hair precisely parted and pomaded, his manner suggesting both efficiency and anxiety. What caught my attention, however, was the obvious quality of his clothing, far superior to what one might expect from a secretary's salary. "Mr. Whitmore," Holmes said, "I understand you were with Mr. Pemberton yesterday afternoon when Mr. Ashford met his unfortunate end." "Indeed, sir. We were reviewing the final accounts for the production, quite a substantial investment, as you might imagine." "Did you know Mr. Ashford personally?" A flicker of something, discomfort, fear, crossed Whitmore's features, only in passing. "I occasionally delivered messages or documents to the actors, but I had little direct interaction with Mr. Ashford. Yet you seem distressed by his death." "Any sudden death is disturbing, Mr. Holmes, particularly under such mysterious circumstances." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Tell me, Mr. Whitmore, are you familiar with the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn?" The effect of this question was electric. Whitmore's face went ashen, his hands trembled visibly, and he took an involuntary step backward. I'm not sure what you mean, sir." "Come now, Mr. Whitmore. Your reaction suggests otherwise. Perhaps this will refresh your memory." Holmes produced the golden cufflink we had discovered on the stage. Whitmore's eyes fixed upon the jewelry with unmistakable recognition and what appeared to be genuine terror. "Where did you find that?" he whispered. "On the stage, near where Mr. Ashford died. I take it you recognize the craftsmanship?" For a moment, it seemed as though Whitmore might faint. Then, with visible effort, he composed himself and straightened his shoulders. "Yes, I recognize it. It belongs to me. Or rather, it did. I lost it several days ago and assumed it had fallen somewhere in the theater during my various errands." "You are a member of the Golden Dawn?" "I was. I left the organization 6 months ago." "Under what circumstances?" Whitmore glanced nervously at Gerald, who was listening to this exchange with obvious bewilderment. "Perhaps we might speak privately, Mr. Holmes." "I think not. Mr. Pemberton has every right to hear anything that might relate to the death that occurred in his theater." "Continue." Whitmore's shoulders sagged in defeat. "Very well. I joined the Golden Dawn 2 years ago, attracted by their studies in ancient wisdom and ceremonial magic. At first it seemed a harmless intellectual pursuit, a gathering of like-minded individuals interested in esoteric knowledge. But it became something more. Much more. As I advanced through the degrees of initiation, I learned that certain members were using the organization for darker purposes. There was talk of using magical knowledge to influence or even harm others. When I expressed my concerns, I was told that such methods were sometimes necessary to protect the Order's secrets. Holmes made notes in his pocketbook. "Did any of these darker activities involve the theatre?" "Not directly, but there were members who spoke of the Orpheum as a place of power, a location where the veil between life and death was particularly thin due to the violent nature of Edmund Blackwood's death." "Did you recognize any of these members?" "Some, though most used ceremonial names rather than their true identities. There was one man, however, who seemed particularly interested in the theatre's history. He called himself Magister Umbra, Master of Shadows, and claimed to have special knowledge of Blackwood's death." "Can you describe this individual?" "Tall, distinguished-looking, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. He spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to command, and the other members deferred to him in all matters." Holmes and I exchanged significant glances. The description could have applied to Sir Nigel Worthington, though it was hardly unique enough to constitute proof of his involvement. "When did you last attend a meeting of the Golden Dawn?" 6 months ago, as I said. I attempted to resign from the organization, but Magister Umbra informed me that such knowledge as I had gained could never be entirely abandoned. He said that the Order had ways of ensuring the loyalty of former members. Was this a threat? I believed so at the time. Shortly afterward, I began to receive anonymous letters suggesting that my employer, Mr. Pemberton, might be interested to learn of my involvement with occult practices. The implication was clear. Gerald stared at his secretary with a mixture of shock and betrayal. "James, why didn't you tell me about this?" What could I say? That I had been dabbling in magic and was now being blackmailed by my former associates? You would have dismissed me immediately. Holmes closed his pocketbook and studied Whitmore intently. "One final question, Mr. Whitmore. Yesterday afternoon, when you claimed to have been with Mr. Pemberton reviewing accounts, did you leave the office at any point?" "Only briefly, when Tobias Grimm came to report the broken backdrop rope. I went to the stage to assess the damage and arrange for its repair." "How long were you absent from the office?" "Perhaps 10 minutes, no more." "And during that time, did you encounter Mr. Ashford?" Whitmore hesitated for just a moment too long. "I may have seen him in passing. The stage area was quite busy with actors and stagehands preparing for the final rehearsal." Holmes made one final note before rising from his chair. "Gentlemen, I thank you for your candor. Mr. Whitmore, I strongly advise you to remain available for further questioning. This investigation is far from concluded." As we made our way back through the theater, Holmes maintained his thoughtful silence until we reached the stage itself. In the morning light, the scene of the previous night's tragedy seemed less ominous but no less mysterious. The Hamlet set dominated the space, its false castle walls and painted battlements creating an elaborate maze of hiding places and secret passages. "Watson," Holmes said suddenly, "examine this backdrop more carefully. Note the way it's constructed, not merely painted canvas, but actual wooden framework designed to support considerable weight." I studied the elaborate set piece he indicated, a section of castle wall complete with projecting stones and decorative elements. It appears quite solid. Indeed, and see here, Holmes pointed to a section near the base of the wall, fresh sawdust, the same fine powder that Gregson's men found on Ashford's clothing. He began examining the backdrop with his magnifying glass, paying particular attention to what appeared to be a decorative panel near the center of the wall. "Most interesting," he murmured. "Watson, this panel appears to be hinged, and there are marks in the sawdust suggesting it has been opened recently. Working together, we discovered that the panel concealed a narrow opening, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, but large enough to allow access to the space behind the backdrop." "A secret passage," I observed. "But leading where?" Holmes had already squeezed through the opening and was examining the space beyond with his electric torch. "Come through, Watson. I believe we've found our phantom's highway." The space behind the backdrop was cramped but functional, a narrow corridor that ran the entire length of the set. More importantly, it connected to a concealed staircase that led upward into the theater's superstructure. "Ingenious," Holmes said as we climbed the hidden stairs. "Someone has created an entirely separate circulation system within the building, a means of moving unseen from the basement to the fly gallery." The staircase emerged into a small chamber directly beneath the stage rigging. From this vantage point, someone could manipulate the counterweight system, adjust ropes and pulleys, or, as had apparently happened to Cornelius Ashford, prepare a deadly trap for an unsuspecting victim. "But how did they lure Ashford onto the stage alone?" I asked. "Perhaps they didn't need to lure him. Perhaps he came of his own accord, believing he was meeting someone for a clandestine conversation. Remember Mrs. Hartwell's testimony about whispered voices during previous rehearsals? What if those conversations were not supernatural phenomena, but very real meetings between conspirators?" Holmes examined the rigging mechanism with particular attention to the area where the fatal rope had been attached. "See here, Watson, additional sawdust and marks suggesting that someone spent considerable time working with these ropes. Our killer is not only familiar with theatrical rigging, but has modified this particular system for his deadly purpose." "Modified how?" "The original counterweight system has been supplemented with an additional pulley arrangement, one that would allow a single person to hoist a considerable weight from below. In effect, someone has turned this rigging into a gallows, operated by remote control." As we made our way back through the secret passage, Holmes paused to examine something near the concealed panel. "Another clue," he said, extracting a small piece of fabric caught on a splinter of wood. "Dark wool, expensive quality, with what appears to be silver thread woven into the pattern." "From a gentleman's evening coat?" "Precisely." "And notice the cut. This is not ordinary wool, but the finest superfine, tailored by someone of considerable skill. There are perhaps a dozen establishments in London capable of such work." We emerged from behind the backdrop to find Inspector Gregson waiting for us, accompanied by a constable and a woman I recognized as Miss Fairfax's maid. "Holmes," Gregson called out. "Perfect timing. Jenny here has something to tell you about yesterday afternoon." The maid, a woman of perhaps 30, with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to discretion, stepped forward nervously. "Begging your pardon, sir," she said, "but I couldn't sleep last night, thinking about poor Mr. Ashford. There's something I didn't mention yesterday, something that seemed unimportant at the time." "Please continue," Holmes encouraged. "It was just after 4 o'clock, while I was helping Miss Fairfax with her costume change. We heard voices from the stage, men's voices having what sounded like an argument. Could you make out what was being said?" "Not the words, sir, but the tone was angry. Miss Fairfax said it was probably just the actors rehearsing, but it didn't sound like lines from the play." "How many voices did you hear?" "2, sir. One I recognized as Mr. Ashford. He had a very distinctive way of speaking, quite theatrical even in normal conversation. The other voice was quieter, more cultured, but I couldn't place it. Holmes exchanged a meaningful look with Gregson. Did this argument continue for long? Perhaps 5 minutes, sir. Then it stopped quite suddenly, and we heard footsteps, someone walking across the stage. After that, everything was quiet until Mr. Grimm raised the alarm. "Jenny," Holmes said gently, "this is very important. Did you hear any sounds that might have indicated a struggle? Anything to suggest that Mr. Ashford was in distress?" The maid considered the question carefully. "Now that you mention it, sir, there was one odd thing. Just before the voices stopped, we heard what sounded like a pulley creaking. You know, the way the rigging sounds when they're moving scenery. But there shouldn't have been any scene changes during that part of the rehearsal." Holmes made detailed notes of Jenny's testimony before dismissing her with instructions to contact the police immediately if she remembered anything else. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" Gregson asked as the maid departed. "A significant development. We now know that Ashford met with someone on the stage shortly before his death, that they argued, and that the rigging system was activated during or immediately after their conversation. But we still don't know who the second person was, don't we?" Holmes smiled grimly. "I believe we have sufficient evidence to narrow our list of suspects considerably. The voice was cultured, suggesting education and social standing. The person was familiar enough with the theatre to use the secret passage system we've just discovered. And most importantly, they possessed the knowledge and skill necessary to operate the modified rigging system. You suspect Sir Nigel. Sir Nigel is certainly a possibility, but there are others who fit the description equally well. What we need now is evidence linking one of our suspects directly to the Golden Dawn and to the events of 17 years ago." As we prepared to leave the theatre, Holmes paused at the stage door and turned back to look at the scene of the crime one final time. "Watson," he said thoughtfully, "there is something about this case that continues to trouble me. The elaborate nature of the murder, the occult symbolism, the connection to events from nearly 2 decades past, it all suggests a level of planning and patience that goes far beyond simple jealousy or professional rivalry. What do you think we're dealing with? I believe we are confronting someone who has waited 17 years for the opportunity to complete what was begun with Edmund Blackwood's death. The question is, what was the original purpose of that murder, and why was it necessary to kill Cornelius Ashford to achieve it? Before I could respond, we were approached by a young newspaper reporter who had been hovering near the theatre entrance. "Mr. Holmes," he called out, "might I have a word? I'm writing a story about the curse of the Orpheum for the Evening Standard." Holmes paused, his expression thoughtful. "Tell me, young man, what do you know about the original tragedy that befell this theatre?" "Only what's in the public record, sir. Edmund Blackwood, the famous actor, killed by falling scenery during a performance of Macbeth. Some say it was an accident, others claim it was the curse of the Scottish play." "And what is your opinion?" The reporter's eyes gleamed with the enthusiasm of youth. "Between you and me, sir, I've been doing some research into theatrical accidents of that period. There were several similar incidents in London theatres during the 1870s. Actors killed or injured by faulty equipment, always during productions of Macbeth or other tragedies." Holmes's attention sharpened considerably. "How many such incidents?" "At least 4 that I've documented, sir, all within a 3-year period. Each time the victim was a leading actor, each time the death appeared accidental, and each time the theatre in question was forced to close due to the resulting superstitions and financial difficulties." "Most illuminating. Tell me, did these incidents share any other common elements?" "Well, sir, in each case there were reports of threatening letters received by the victims, and in at least 2 instances, witnesses reported seeing a mysterious figure in evening dress watching from the theatre's upper levels shortly before the accidents occurred." Holmes handed the young man his card. "Mr. Peterson, sir. Harold Peterson of the Evening Standard." "Mr. Peterson, I believe your research may prove invaluable to this investigation. Might I suggest you examine the membership records of any occult or mystical societies that were active in London during the 1870s. Pay particular attention to any organizations with theatrical connections." As the reporter hurried away, clutching Holmes's card like a precious talisman, I turned to my friend with growing understanding. You believe we're dealing with a serial killer, someone who has been murdering actors for nearly 20 years? More than that, Watson. I believe we are confronting an organization, this Order of the Sacred Stage mentioned in the threatening letters, a group dedicated to some twisted notion of purifying the theater through violence and terror. But what could drive such fanaticism? Holmes's expression grew grave as we hailed a hansom cab for the journey back to Baker Street. That, my dear fellow, is precisely what we must discover before the phantom of the Orpheum claims another victim. For I fear that Cornelius Ashford's death was not the end of this bloody drama, but merely the beginning of its final, terrible act. The remainder of that day was spent in feverish activity as Holmes pursued the various threads of our investigation with characteristic intensity. While I attended to my medical practice, he dispatched telegrams to his network of informants, consulted with experts on theatrical history, and made several mysterious visits to locations he refused to identify. I returned to Baker Street that evening to find him surrounded by documents, newspaper clippings, and what appeared to be architectural drawings of the Orpheum Theatre. His expression was one of grim satisfaction, the look of a hunter who had finally cornered his quarry. "Ah, Watson," he said without looking up from his papers, "perfect timing. I have spent the day unraveling the most elaborate and diabolical conspiracy it has ever been my misfortune to encounter. You've solved the case?" "Not merely solved it, exposed it in all its terrible complexity. What we are dealing with is not a simple murder, but the culmination of a campaign of terror that has been 20 years in the making." I poured myself a brandy and settled into my chair. "Tell me everything." Holmes arranged his papers with methodical precision before beginning his explanation. The key to understanding this entire affair lies in recognizing that the death of Edmund Blackwood in 1874 was not an isolated incident, but part of a systematic campaign to control London's theatrical world through fear and intimidation. You mentioned other similar deaths. Indeed, young Peterson's research proved invaluable. Between 1872 and 1875, 5 prominent actors died in what appeared to be theatrical accidents. Each was performing in a tragedy, each had received threatening letters, and each death occurred in a manner that suggested supernatural intervention while actually being the result of carefully planned sabotage. Holmes produced a detailed chart showing the dates, locations, and circumstances of each death. The pattern becomes clear when viewed in aggregate. Someone was systematically eliminating the most talented tragic actors in London, always in ways that would generate maximum publicity and superstitious terror. But to what end? Control, Watson. By creating an atmosphere of supernatural dread around certain theatres and productions, this organization, the Order of the Sacred Stage, was able to manipulate the theatrical world to their advantage. Venues could be acquired cheaply after being cursed, rival productions could be sabotaged, and actors could be controlled through fear. I studied the chart with growing horror. And Cornelius Ashford's death? The resumption of operations after a 17-year hiatus. The Order went underground after their initial campaign, but the reopening of the Orpheum presented an irresistible opportunity to complete their work. You know who leads this organization? Holmes's smile was predatory. I know far more than that, my dear fellow. I know their identities, their methods, and most importantly, I know their plans for tonight. Tonight? Did you imagine they would be content with a single murder? The Order has invested too much time and effort in creating their theatrical reign of terror to stop now. They intend to stage a spectacular finale that will cement the Orpheum's reputation as a cursed venue and drive away any possibility of successful competition. Holmes rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the fog-shrouded street. I received word this afternoon that despite yesterday's tragedy, Gerald Pemberton has decided to proceed with tonight's opening performance. His investors are pressuring him to recoup their losses, and the company, motivated by a mixture of professional obligation and morbid curiosity, has agreed to perform. Surely not. Indeed they have. The show, as they say, must go on, which provides our conspirators with the perfect opportunity to strike again, this time before an audience that will spread word of the theatre's curse throughout London. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November evening. Holmes, we must warn them. Warn them, yes. But more than that, we must catch the perpetrators in the act. I have spent the afternoon arranging certain preparations of my own. Tonight, the phantom of the Orpheum will finally be unmasked. 2 hours later, we stood once again before the Orpheum Theatre, but this time the building blazed with light and bustled with activity. Despite the previous day's tragedy, a considerable crowd had gathered for the opening performance, some drawn by genuine interest in the production, others by the morbid curiosity that surrounds any venue touched by mysterious death. Inspector Gregson met us at the stage door, his expression tense with anticipation. "Everything is arranged as you requested, Holmes. My men are positioned throughout the building, and we've identified all the entrances and exits." "Excellent. Remember, Gregson, we must allow events to unfold naturally until the perpetrator reveals himself. Any premature action on our part could result in another death." As we made our way through the theatre's corridors, I was struck by the contrast between the bustling activity of opening night and the oppressive atmosphere that had characterized our previous visits. Actors hurried past in full costume, stagehands adjusted final details of scenery and lighting, and the general excitement of theatrical performance filled the air. Yet beneath this surface energy, I sensed an undercurrent of tension and fear. The actors' laughter was too loud, their conversations too animated, as if they were desperately trying to convince themselves that the previous night's events had been merely an unfortunate accident. We found the company assembled in the green room, putting the finishing touches on their preparations. Miss Fairfax, resplendent in her costume as Gertrude, was pale but composed. Sebastian Cross, now elevated to the starring role of Hamlet, paced nervously while reviewing his lines. Sir Nigel Worthington sat calmly in his chair, the very picture of professional composure despite the circumstances. "Ladies and gentlemen," Holmes announced as we entered, "I trust you are all prepared for what promises to be a memorable evening." "Mr. Holmes," Miss Fairfax said, rising from her chair, "surely you don't expect us to perform after what happened to poor Cornelius?" "On the contrary, Miss Fairfax. I believe tonight's performance will provide the answers we seek. The phantom of the Orpheum cannot resist the opportunity to complete his work before an audience." Sebastian Cross stopped his pacing and fixed Holmes with an intense stare. "You speak as if you know who killed Cornelius." "I have my suspicions, Mr. Cross. Tonight will prove whether they are correct." Before anyone could respond, Tobias Grimm appeared in the doorway, his face flushed with exertion. "Ladies and gentlemen, 15 minutes to curtain. Final preparations, if you please." As the actors began to disperse, Holmes caught my arm. "Watson, I want you to position yourself in the upper box, stage right. From there, you'll have a clear view of both the stage and the fly gallery. Watch for any unusual movement or activity." "What about you?" "I'll be moving throughout the building, coordinating with Gregson's men. Remember, our phantom is likely to strike during the most dramatic moment of the performance, probably the final duel between Hamlet and Laertes." I made my way to the designated box, finding it equipped with a small table and chair that provided an excellent vantage point. From this position, I could see the entire stage, the rigging system above, and most of the wings and backstage areas. The theatre was filling rapidly, and the excited murmur of the audience created an atmosphere of anticipation that was almost palpable. The performance began precisely on schedule, and I was reminded of the power of great theatre to transport both actors and audience into another world. Despite the tragedy that had befallen the company, the production was masterful. Sebastian Cross proved himself a capable replacement for Ashford, bringing a brooding intensity to Hamlet that was perfectly suited to the role. As the first act unfolded, I found myself dividing my attention between the performance and my surveillance duties. Every shadow in the wings, every movement in the fly gallery, every face in the audience received my careful scrutiny. Yet nothing seemed amiss. The evening was proceeding exactly as any normal theatrical performance might. It was during the second act, as Hamlet confronted his mother in her chamber, that I first noticed something unusual. A figure had appeared in the stage left box directly across from my position. A tall man in evening dress who seemed to be watching the performance with unusual intensity. Even from my distance, I could see that his attention was focused not on the actors, but on the rigging system above the stage. I studied the figure more carefully, trying to determine his identity. He was well-dressed and distinguished-looking, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. As he leaned forward in his seat, I caught a glimpse of his profile and felt a shock of recognition. It was Sir Nigel Worthington, but Sir Nigel was on stage at that very moment, playing Polonius in the scene with Hamlet and Gertrude. The figure in the box bore a striking resemblance to the elderly actor, but it was clearly not the same person. I was so absorbed in studying this mysterious figure that I nearly missed the moment when he produced a small telescope and began adjusting what appeared to be a mechanical device attached to the box's railing. The realization of what I was witnessing struck me like a physical blow. This was no mere spectator, but the Phantom himself preparing to strike again. I immediately began making my way toward the stage-left box, moving as quickly as stealth would allow. The corridors were dimly lit and filled with the echoes of the performance, making it difficult to navigate silently. By the time I reached the box, however, the mysterious figure had vanished, leaving only the mechanical device attached to the railing. The device was a marvel of engineering, a compact apparatus that appeared to combine elements of a telescope, a crossbow, and a pulley system. A thin wire ran from the device across the theatre to a point somewhere above the stage, invisible to the naked eye, but clearly intended to serve some deadly purpose. I was examining the device more closely when I heard footsteps behind me. Turning, I found myself facing a tall, distinguished man in evening dress, the same figure I had been observing, but now seen clearly in the gaslight of the corridor. "Dr. Watson," he said, in a cultured voice tinged with amusement. "How good of you to join me. I was wondering when you or your friend would discover my little observation post." "Who are you?" I demanded, my hand moving instinctively toward the service revolver in my coat pocket. "I am disappointed that you don't recognize me, Doctor, though I suppose 17 years can change a man considerably." He stepped closer, and I could see that what I had taken for silver hair was actually an elaborate wig, and the distinguished features were partially the result of theatrical makeup. "Edmund Blackwood," I breathed, the truth hitting me like a thunderbolt. "Very good, Doctor, though I have been using the name Edward Blackwood for some years now, a simple change that has allowed me to move freely in theatrical circles without attracting unwanted attention." I stared at him in amazement. "But you're supposed to be dead. You died on this very stage 17 years ago." "A carefully staged deception, I'm afraid. The Order of the Sacred Stage required a martyr to launch our campaign of purification, and I was willing to provide one. My death was accomplished through a combination of stage magic, carefully placed accomplices, and a body procured from the London morgue." "But why? What could possibly motivate such an elaborate deception?" Blackwood's expression grew fanatical. "The theatre had become corrupted, Doctor. Vulgar melodramas, trivial comedies, and performances that pandered to the lowest common denominator. The sacred art of tragedy was being degraded by commercial considerations and inferior talent. So you decided to purify it through murder. Through selective elimination of the unworthy, yes. Each death served a purpose, removing mediocre performers, creating an atmosphere of supernatural dread that would discourage commercial exploitation and demonstrating the power of the Order to those who might consider defying us." I could hear the performance continuing below, approaching the climactic duel scene. "And tonight, what do you intend?" "Tonight, we complete the work that was interrupted 17 years ago. The Orpheum will be permanently closed, its reputation as a cursed venue established beyond question. And Mr. Sebastian Cross will join the ranks of actors who have paid the ultimate price for their presumption." As he spoke, I realized that his mechanical device was not aimed at the stage but at the audience. The wire I had observed led not to the rigging system, but to a large chandelier suspended above the theatre's orchestra section. "You intend to kill innocent spectators. I intend to create a legend that will endure for generations. The chandelier will fall at the climactic moment of the duel, creating casualties that will be attributed to the theatre's curse. No one will ever again dare to perform tragedy in the Orpheum. I moved to draw my revolver, but Blackwood was faster. He produced a small but wicked-looking knife and pressed it to my throat. "I think not, Doctor. You will remain perfectly still while I complete my work. Any attempt to interfere will result in your immediate death." From my position in the box, I could see Holmes moving through the audience below, clearly searching for some sign of the threat he knew was coming. I tried to catch his attention, but the distance and the dim lighting made it impossible. On stage, the duel between Hamlet and Laertes was reaching its climax. Sebastian Cross and the actor playing Laertes moved through their choreographed combat with skill and passion, their swords flashing in the calcium lights. The audience was completely absorbed in the drama, unaware of the deadly threat suspended above their heads. Blackwood had returned his attention to the mechanical device, making final adjustments with the precision of a master craftsman. I could see the wire leading to the chandelier growing taut as he prepared to release the mechanism that would send tons of crystal and metal crashing down upon the unsuspecting audience. "Now, Doctor," he said, without looking away from his work, "you will witness the birth of a legend that will reshape the theatrical world forever." It was at that moment that I heard Holmes's voice, clear and commanding, cutting through the sounds of the performance. "Edmund Blackwood, or should I say Edward Blackwood, of the Order of the Sacred Stage." The effect on Blackwood was electric. He spun toward the voice, his knife momentarily forgotten, and I saw my opportunity. Lunging forward, I grasped the mechanical device and twisted it with all my strength, snapping the wire that connected it to the chandelier. Blackwood snarled and turned the knife toward me, but before he could strike, Holmes appeared in the box doorway, flanked by two of Gregson's constables. "I think not, sir," Holmes said calmly. "Your career as the Phantom of the Orpheum has reached its final curtain." The arrest of Edmund Blackwood, for that was indeed his true identity, created a sensation that eclipsed even the scandal of Cornelius Ashford's murder. The revelation that London's most notorious theatrical ghost was actually a living man who had faked his own death to launch a campaign of terror sent shockwaves through both the theatrical world and the general public. In the days that followed, as Holmes and I provided testimony to the authorities and assisted in the investigation,